The version of World War II that most people carry in their heads is a story. It has a structure. It has a beginning where evil rises, a middle where good organizes itself against that evil, and an end where good wins. It has heroes who knew what they were doing and why it mattered. It has villains whose monstrousness sets them apart from the rest of humanity. It has clarity, and that clarity is the first thing that needs to go, because it was never real. It was constructed deliberately and carefully by governments, by military institutions, by film studios, by publishing houses, and by the collective psychological need of populations who could not absorb what had actually happened without a framework that made survival feel like it meant something. What actually happened was more complicated, more bureaucratic, more procedural, and in many ways more disturbing than the story. Not because the atrocities were worse than described, though many were, but because of how normal they were made to feel by the people who carried them out and the institutions that organized them. The war did not function through passion or ideology alone. It functioned through paperwork. It functioned through schedules, through supply chains, through personnel records, through requisition forms, through promotion criteria, through standardized procedures applied with remarkable consistency across thousands of locations simultaneously. The machinery of the Second World War was exactly that. Machinery. And machinery does not hate. It does not believe in anything. It simply runs. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes from understanding this. It is different from the discomfort of learning that something terrible happened. Most people can absorb that. What is harder to absorb is learning that the terrible thing was organized, tracked, evaluated, optimized, and discussed in meetings where men sat around tables with coffee and cigarettes and talked about efficiency. That is the discomfort this script is built around. Not the chaos of war. Not the exceptional cruelty of particular individuals, but the quiet, methodical, institutional nature of how the war actually functioned on all sides. Because that is the part that history books, as they are usually written for general audiences, tend to soften or omit. And it is the part that matters most if you want to understand not just what happened between 1939 and 1945, but how it was possible at all. The Allied bombing campaigns of Germany and Japan have been written about extensively. The RAF and the United States Army Air Forces dropped millions of tons of ordnance over the course of the war. What is discussed less often is the internal deliberation about civilian casualties, not the question of whether they would occur, but how many were acceptable and whether they served strategic purpose. In early 1942, the RAF's Bomber Command shifted its official policy from precision bombing of industrial targets to what it called area bombing. The internal document that authorized this shift, the directive from the Air Ministry dated February 1942, used language that was careful and technical. It spoke of the morale of the enemy civilian population, particularly of the industrial workers, as a legitimate target. This was not a decision made in anger or in the heat of battle. It was made in offices, by men in uniforms who held formal ranks, who reviewed statistical analyses and wrote memoranda, and signed documents that were then filed and stored. The decision to systematically bomb civilian residential areas in German cities was a bureaucratic decision. It was treated as such by those who made it, and it was implemented with the same organizational discipline that any other military operation received. The bombing of Hamburg in July and August of 1943 killed somewhere between 34,000 and 40,000 people over the course of 10 days. The fires that the incendiary bombs created were so intense that they generated their own wind system, drawing oxygen inward toward the burning areas at speeds that reached hurricane force. People in the streets were pulled off their feet. People in shelters suffocated as the fires consumed the available oxygen. The temperature in some parts of the city reached over 800 degrees Celsius. The operation was given a name. It was called Operation Gomorrah. The name was chosen deliberately. It was a reference to divine punishment, to the destruction of a city whose existence had become unacceptable. The men who chose that name were not expressing uncontrolled rage. They were making an administrative decision about what to call a planned military operation. Then they held briefings, distributed target maps, assigned crew roles, checked aircraft, filled out pre-mission documentation, and flew the missions. After the missions, they filed after-action reports. Losses were recorded. Damage assessments were compiled. The whole thing was documented with the thoroughness that any professional military organization applies to its operations. What was not prominently documented, and what did not appear in official communiques or in the press coverage that followed, was the specific and detailed nature of what the survivors experienced on the ground. Children whose bodies were found fused to the asphalt of roads that had melted in the heat. Families who survived in shelters only to find that the city they emerged into no longer existed in any recognizable form. The administrative record of the bombing of Hamburg is extraordinarily complete. The human record is much harder to find, because it was not the kind of record that institutions typically maintain. Institutions maintain records of what they did and how well they did it. They do not typically maintain records of what it felt like to be on the receiving end. This pattern, where the institutional record is detailed and the human record is sparse or suppressed, is one of the most consistent features of the war across all sides and all theaters. It is not accidental. Institutions generate the records that serve institutional purposes. The purpose of a military operation record is to evaluate effectiveness and inform future operations. It is not to document suffering. Suffering appears in such records only when it is operationally relevant, when it provides data about bomb damage, about the effectiveness of particular munitions, about the accuracy of targeting. As a human experience, it is simply not part of the institutional framework. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 has become perhaps the most debated strategic bombing operation of the entire war. It killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people, according to the most careful post-war assessments, though estimates at the time and for decades afterward were significantly higher, sometimes reaching figures of 200,000. Numbers that were not supported by the available evidence, but that served various political purposes in the post-war period. What is less often discussed is the specific context in which the decision to bomb Dresden was made. By February 1945, the war in Europe was clearly nearing its end. Germany was being compressed from east and west simultaneously. The Soviet forces were advancing rapidly. Dresden was a city with significant rail infrastructure, but it was also a city that had not been heavily targeted previously and that had a substantial refugee population at the time of the bombing, people fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. The British and American planners who authorized the operation knew that the city was crowded with refugees. This was in the operational assessments. It was not a secret. It was a known factor that was weighed against the stated military objectives and found not to be disqualifying. The decision was made, the missions were flown, and the city burned. In the aftermath, the official response was to emphasize the military justification while avoiding detailed discussion of the civilian toll. The RAF's initial communique described the raid as an attack on an important industrial center. This was technically defensible, but substantively misleading. Dresden was not primarily an industrial city. It was known throughout Europe as a city of culture and art, of Baroque architecture and porcelain manufacturing. The deliberate framing of the post-raid communication was not accidental. It was a choice made by institutions that understood the value of controlling information about what they had done. The institutional management of information about Allied actions is a thread that runs through the entire war and continues well into the post-war period. The United States military maintained a system of censorship that was both formal and comprehensive. The Office of Censorship, established by executive order shortly after Pearl Harbor, had authority over all communications leaving the country, including personal mail, press dispatches, and broadcast content. The formal justification was operational security, the prevention of information that might be useful to the enemy from leaving the country. In practice, the censorship system also functioned to manage domestic perceptions of the war. Photographs of American dead were suppressed for the first year and a half of American involvement in the war. The official rationale was that such images would be damaging to morale. The practical effect was that the American public had a significantly sanitized understanding of what the war was actually costing in human terms. When the policy was partially relaxed in 1943, and images of American war dead began to appear in publications like Life magazine, the change was managed carefully. The images that were released were selected to convey sacrifice and dignity, rather than the random brutality of how bodies actually appear after violent death. The soldiers in the approved photographs looked like soldiers. They did not look like what high-velocity projectiles and explosive fragmentation actually do to human bodies, which is something that cannot be made to look dignified or meaningful because it is not. It is simply physics. The management of the dead extended beyond photographic policy. The United States military's Graves Registration Service was responsible for locating, identifying, and processing the remains of American servicemen killed in action. By the end of the war, this service had processed the remains of more than 200,000 American service members killed in the European and Pacific theaters. The logistics of this were extraordinary. The service maintained detailed records, developed systematic procedures for identification, and managed the transportation and burial of remains across enormous geographic distances. What this meant in practice was that there was a bureaucratic infrastructure dedicated to the dead, staffed by personnel who spent their working days handling human remains, who filled out forms describing the condition of bodies, who made decisions about identification based on physical evidence and personal effects, who wrote letters to next of kin using language that had been standardized and approved. The grief of individual families was processed through this system the same way any other operational matter was processed. There were procedures. The procedures were followed. The Japanese Imperial Army's treatment of prisoners of war is well documented in broad terms. What is less commonly examined is the specific bureaucratic structure within which that treatment was organized and sanctioned. The Japanese military had a particular institutional attitude toward surrender that shaped its policies toward those who had surrendered. In the Japanese military value system, surrender was a profound disgrace. A soldier who surrendered had forfeited his honor and, in a meaningful sense, his identity as a legitimate person. This was not merely a cultural attitude held by individual soldiers. It was an official doctrine, codified in the Senjin-kun, the field service code issued by the Japanese War Ministry in 1941. This document was not a suggestion. It was official military policy, issued through formal channels bearing the authority of the War Ministry. When Japanese forces mistreated and killed prisoners of war, they were operating within a framework that had been officially constructed and distributed by institutional authority. The Death Railway, the roughly 400 kilometers of rail line built through the Thai-Burma jungle using Allied prisoner labor and forced Asian labor, killed somewhere between 12,000 and 16,000 Allied prisoners, and an estimated 90,000 to 100,000 Asian laborers. The work was done in conditions of deliberate brutality, with inadequate food, no medical care, brutal physical punishment for perceived failures to work, and complete indifference to the survival of those doing the work. The construction was organized and managed by Japanese military engineers who filed progress reports, met construction deadlines, and operated within a standard military administrative framework. The brutality was not chaos. It was policy. The engineers knew their labor force was being worked to death. The information was available to them. It did not change the management of the project because the survival of the workers was not an operational parameter that anyone with decision-making authority had assigned value to. The Bataan Death March of April 1942 involved the forced movement of approximately 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war over roughly 65 miles of road under conditions that killed somewhere between 5,000 and 18,000 of them, depending on the methodology used to count. The march was the result of a Japanese operational plan that had not adequately accounted for the number of prisoners that would be taken and had not allocated the resources to feed or transport them. This is important to understand. The deaths on the Bataan Death March were not all the result of deliberate killing, though deliberate killing occurred throughout. Many of them were the result of an operational plan that treated the logistics of prisoner management as an afterthought, assigning no resources to it and no personnel responsible for the welfare of the prisoners. The prisoners died of dehydration, starvation, heat exhaustion, and violence from guards who had not been given clear orders about the treatment of prisoners and who operated within an institutional culture that viewed the prisoners as having no legitimate claim on decent treatment. When Japanese officers were tried for war crimes related to the Bataan Death March after the war, the legal proceedings confronted a genuine and unresolved tension in international law. Military commanders can be held responsible for what their subordinates do if they knew about it and failed to stop it, or if they should have known about it. But the doctrine of command responsibility, as it was applied at the post-war tribunals, was being developed and refined in real time, applied retroactively to actions that had been taken under circumstances where no such legal framework had been clearly established. General Masaharu Homma, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines, was executed in April 1946 for the atrocities committed during the Bataan Death March, despite evidence that he had not personally ordered the march, had not been fully informed of the conditions, and had in fact issued orders intended to improve treatment of prisoners. The legal standard applied to him was that as commander, he was responsible for what happened under his command. This standard, applied consistently, would have implicated a very large number of military commanders on multiple sides of the war. It was not applied consistently. The post-war tribunals at Nuremberg and Tokyo are frequently cited as evidence that the international community held perpetrators accountable for the crimes of the war. What is less frequently examined is the selectivity that was built into both proceedings from the beginning. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted 24 major defendants and resulted in 12 death sentences. The Tokyo trials prosecuted 28 Class A war criminals and resulted in 7 death sentences. These numbers need to be considered against the scale of what was prosecuted. The Holocaust killed approximately 6 million Jews and millions of additional victims across multiple categories. The Japanese military's actions in China alone, encompassing the Nanjing massacre, systematic atrocities in the occupied territories, the use of biological and chemical weapons, and the forced labor of millions, involved crimes on a scale that the handful of prosecutions at Tokyo did not begin to address. The decisions about who would be prosecuted and who would not were made for reasons that were partly legal and partly political. Many individuals who had committed documented war crimes were not prosecuted because they possessed information or capabilities that the occupying powers found useful. This was true in both Europe and Asia, and the pattern was strikingly consistent across different categories of crime and different categories of perpetrator. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that operated primarily in Manchuria between 1935 and 1945. The unit conducted experiments on human subjects, overwhelmingly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, that included deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases, vivisection without anesthesia, weapons testing on living subjects, exposure to extremes of temperature and pressure, and a range of other procedures whose purpose was to generate data about the effects of biological and chemical agents on human physiology. The number of people who died as a result of Unit 731's operations is estimated at between 3,000 and 12,000 in the direct experimental program, with additional deaths resulting from the deliberate release of biological agents in Chinese cities and communities, which may have killed hundreds of thousands. After the war, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters negotiated an arrangement with the former leadership of Unit 731, in which the Americans received the research data that the unit had generated in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The men who had designed, supervised, and carried out years of lethal human experimentation were given a legal shield by the United States government because the data they had generated about biological warfare had potential military value. The chief of Unit 731, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, was never prosecuted. He lived until 1959. Many of his colleagues went on to successful careers in Japanese academic medicine and public health institutions after the war. The institutional knowledge that had been developed through the torture and murder of thousands of people was simply absorbed into the post-war research infrastructure, first of the United States, and then, as Japanese researchers resumed normal academic careers, of Japan's civilian scientific establishment. The United States government's classification of documents related to Unit 731 and the post-war immunity arrangement persisted for decades after the war. Researchers began to piece together the story from Japanese sources in the 1980s. The American records were not fully declassified until the 1990s, under legislation specifically directed at the issue. The 50-year delay in public access to these records was not accidental. It was a managed suppression of information about a decision that the government that had made it judged to be embarrassing or legally problematic if widely known. The German rocket program and its post-war continuation through Operation Paperclip follows a structurally identical pattern. The V-2 ballistic missile program, which produced the rockets that struck London and Antwerp and other targets in the closing years of the war, was built on the labor of concentration camp inmates. The Mittelwerk facility in the Harz Mountains, where V-2 rockets were manufactured in underground tunnels, used primarily inmates from the Dora concentration camp. The working conditions in the Mittelwerk were such that more people died building the V-2 than were killed by the V-2 as a weapon. Estimates of the death toll among the forced laborers range from 10,000 to 20,000 over the roughly 2 years the facility operated. Werner von Braun was the technical director of the V-2 program. He held the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major in Heinrich Himmler's SS. He visited the Mittelwerk and the Dora camp. He requested workers from the camp system and received them. After the war, he was recruited by the United States under Operation Paperclip, which was a program specifically designed to bring German scientists and engineers with militarily valuable knowledge into American service regardless of their wartime activities. Von Braun became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center and a central figure in the American space program. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977. His SS membership, his use of concentration camp labor, his knowledge of the conditions at Dora, and his requests for additional forced workers from the camp system were all known to American officials at the time of his recruitment. They were assessed and found not to be disqualifying. The assessment was made by institutions operating within a framework where the strategic value of his knowledge outweighed every other consideration. Operation Paperclip recruited approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians in this manner. The operation was technically illegal under existing American policy, which explicitly excluded from immigration those who had been members of the Nazi Party and those who had been more than nominal participants in Nazi activities. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which ran the operation, addressed this problem by altering or destroying records of the recruits' wartime activities, removing documentation of party membership and wartime roles from their files before processing. This was not a rogue action by a few individuals. It was an institutional decision made by an agency with authority over the matter, carried out systematically across hundreds of cases. The Soviet Union ran parallel programs to recruit German technical expertise, with less concern for the procedural complications that American officials had to manage around domestic immigration law. Soviet teams in occupied Germany in 1945 removed entire research facilities, including the personnel who had staffed them, and transported them to the Soviet Union. Rocket engineers, aircraft designers, chemical weapons specialists, and researchers from multiple fields were relocated to Soviet research installations where they worked, under varying degrees of coercion, on projects that advanced Soviet military capabilities. The expertise that had been developed in the service of one totalitarian state was transferred directly to another, with no intermediate period of accountability or assessment of the moral status of those being transferred. The British also recruited German scientists and engineers in the immediate post-war period, though their program was smaller and less systematically organized than the American effort. The common thread across all these national programs was the institutional judgment that the technical value of what the recruits knew outweighed the moral or legal complications of what they had done. This was not a judgment that was publicly announced. It was a judgment that was made in classified settings and implemented through procedures designed to obscure its nature. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war by Germany represents one of the largest single episodes of mass killing in the entire war, and it is one of the least familiar to general audiences outside of academic historical circles. The German military captured approximately 5.5 million Soviet prisoners over the course of the war. Of these, approximately 3.5 million died in German captivity. The death rate was roughly 63%. By comparison, the death rate among Western Allied prisoners held by Germany was approximately 3 to 4%. The difference was not accidental, and it was not simply the result of resource constraints. The legal framework that Germany applied to Soviet prisoners was deliberately constructed to exclude them from the protections of the Geneva Convention. The official German position was that the Soviet Union had not ratified the relevant international conventions, and therefore German forces were not bound by those conventions in their treatment of Soviet prisoners. This argument was legally questionable, even by the standards of the time, as the basic principles of humane treatment of prisoners were widely regarded as part of customary international law that applied regardless of treaty status. But the legal argument provided the institutional framework within which decisions about prisoner treatment were made. Once the framework had been established that Soviet prisoners had no legal claim on decent treatment, the decisions that followed from that framework were made and implemented through normal administrative channels. The starvation of Soviet prisoners was, in many cases, a deliberate policy rather than a consequence of resource scarcity. Internal German military documents from 1941 and 1942 show that the decision to provide Soviet prisoners with inadequate rations was made at the institutional level, with explicit awareness that the rations being assigned were below what was needed to sustain life. The Quartermaster General's office, the administrative branch responsible for supply and logistics, was directly involved in these decisions. The people who made them were not combat soldiers in the grip of battle fury. They were administrators. They sat in offices and processed documents and made calculations about food allocation, and they made the calculation that Soviet prisoners would receive less than what was needed to survive. The specific conditions in which Soviet prisoners were held in the early period of the war, before permanent camp facilities were established, were often simply open fields enclosed by wire, without shelter, without sanitation, without medical care, and with minimal food. Prisoners died of exposure, starvation, disease, and direct violence at rates that, in the winter of 1941 to 1942, sometimes reached several thousand per day in a single enclosure. The German military's own internal records document these deaths in the same administrative language used to document any other operational matter. Numbers of prisoners received, numbers of deaths, causes of death as categorized by the recording officer. The record-keeping was thorough. The deaths it documented were the result of policies that the institutions producing those records had established and implemented. The systematic murder of Soviet Jews, which was the most intensive phase of the Holocaust in terms of the speed and density of killing, was carried out primarily by the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed behind the advancing German army. Between June 1941 and the end of 1942, the Einsatzgruppen and supporting units killed approximately 1.5 million Jews, primarily by shooting. The operational reports of the Einsatzgruppen, which were compiled and distributed within the SS administrative system, are among the most methodically bureaucratic documents produced during the entire war. They list the locations of operations, the numbers of people killed, the categories of people killed as defined by the classification systems, the units used, and assessments of the operational efficiency of the killing process. They are written in the flat, impersonal language of administrative reports, because that is what they were. They were filed with the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin, read by senior officials, compiled into summary reports, and incorporated into the institutional records of the SS. The progression from mobile killing units to the industrialized killing of the death camps followed a logic of administrative optimization. The Einsatzgruppen were effective in terms of their kill rate, but presented management challenges. The psychological stress on the personnel carrying out the shootings was documented and discussed within the SS administrative structure as an operational problem. The use of gas vans, sealed vehicles into which exhaust fumes were directed, was introduced partly as a response to this documented morale problem among the personnel doing the killing. The transition to purpose-built gas chambers in permanent installations followed a similar administrative logic. The killing could be organized more efficiently if it was centralized in specific locations with purpose-designed facilities and trained personnel. The people who designed the facilities, who allocated the construction materials, who managed the transportation networks that moved victims to the camps, who scheduled the trains, who processed the paperwork that tracked the movement of people through the system, were performing administrative functions within a bureaucratic framework. They were solving logistics problems. The context in which those logistics problems existed was the systematic murder of millions of people, but the problems themselves were problems of the same type that administrative personnel solve in any large institutional system. Adolf Eichmann's post-war trial in Jerusalem in 1961 produced testimony that illustrated this dynamic with unusual clarity. Eichmann, who had been the head of the SS's Jewish Affairs section and had been centrally responsible for the logistical organization of deportations to the death camps, presented himself as a bureaucrat who had followed orders and processed paperwork. This presentation was partly self-serving, an attempt to minimize his culpability, but it was not entirely false. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who observed the trial and wrote about it, used the phrase "the banality of evil," which has been widely misunderstood. Arendt was not arguing that Eichmann was ordinary or that evil is ordinary. She was making a specific observation about the relationship between bureaucratic function and moral agency, about how institutional structures can create conditions in which individuals perform actions with terrible consequences while experiencing themselves as simply doing their jobs. The argument was disturbing because it was accurate, and because its accuracy implied things about institutional participation in atrocity that people preferred not to examine. The concentration camp system within Germany and German-occupied Europe employed hundreds of thousands of people over the course of its existence from 1933 through 1945. This included guards, administrative personnel, medical staff, engineers, transportation workers, suppliers, and the various civilian contractors and businesses that provided goods and services to the camps. The total number of people who worked within the camp system in some capacity has been estimated at several 100,000. Most of them were not ideological fanatics. Most of them had jobs and performed those jobs within the constraints of the institutional environment they occupied. The guards at Auschwitz received the same kind of performance evaluations that employees in any hierarchical organization receive. The SS ran training programs for camp personnel. There were standards, procedures, and institutional expectations. The people who worked within this system navigated it the same way people navigate institutional environments generally, by learning what was expected, performing what was required, and accommodating themselves to the norms of their particular workplace. The economic integration of the camp system with the broader German war economy was extensive and systematic. The use of camp inmates as forced labor by private corporations is documented in detail. Companies including IG Farben, Krupp, BMW, Volkswagen, and dozens of others operated facilities using concentration camp labor. The legal and financial arrangements for this labor were formalized. The SS charged companies a daily fee per worker, differentiated by skill category, with lower rates for unskilled labor and higher rates for workers with technical skills. The companies paid these fees, received the workers, managed their labor within their facilities, and returned them to the camp system at the end of the working period or when they were no longer capable of working. This was a commercial transaction, conducted through standard commercial channels, involving standard financial documentation. The companies that participated in this system were performing normal business activities within the legal and commercial framework that Nazi Germany had constructed. After the war, some of these companies faced legal proceedings. Most did not. The ones that did typically paid fines or settlements that were small, relative to the profits generated by the forced labor. Several of the largest companies involved in concentration camp labor use exist today as major international corporations. The racial classification system that the German government developed and implemented was a legal structure with administrative apparatus. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which defined categories of Jewish identity and established legal distinctions based on those categories, required the creation of supporting administrative infrastructure. There had to be registries, documentation requirements, enforcement mechanisms, and the bureaucratic personnel to manage all of these. Civil registration offices across Germany and eventually occupied Europe were tasked with maintaining records that categorized the population by racial classification. Local government offices processed applications for certificates of racial status. Courts adjudicated disputes about classification. The entire apparatus of racial classification functioned through existing civil administrative structures, simply redirected toward a new set of administrative tasks. The people performing these tasks were in many cases the same local government clerks and registry officials who had been performing ordinary administrative functions before the Nuremberg laws were passed. They were given new categories to track and new forms to fill out, and they did so. The deportation of Jews from across German-occupied Europe to the death camps in occupied Poland depended entirely on the cooperation of local administrative structures in each occupied country. In France, the Vichy government that administered unoccupied France maintained its own police apparatus, which actively participated in rounding up Jews for deportation. The Vel de Hive roundup of July 1942, in which over 13,000 Jews, including more than 4,000 children, were arrested by French police and held in the Velodrome d'Hiver sports stadium before being transferred to transit camps and then to Auschwitz, was organized and carried out by French authorities. The German occupation forces requested it, and the French police carried it out. The French government did not officially acknowledge institutional responsibility for this action until 1995, when President Jacques Chirac made a statement of formal acknowledgement. For 5 decades, the official French position had been that the Vichy government was not a legitimate continuation of the French state, and therefore France as an institution bore no responsibility for what it had done. The situation in the Netherlands was somewhat different. Dutch administration of the Jewish population during German occupation was carried out with an efficiency that resulted in a higher percentage of Jewish deaths than in any other Western European country under German occupation. Approximately 75% of the Jewish population of the Netherlands was killed, compared to approximately 25% in France. The difference in outcomes has been studied carefully by historians, and among the factors identified is the nature of the Dutch civil registration system, which was unusually complete and accurate, providing German occupation authorities and Dutch officials with a precise mapping of the Jewish population and the degree to which Dutch administrative institutions cooperated in the implementation of German anti-Jewish measures. The efficiency of Dutch administration, applied to the task of identifying and locating Jews for deportation, resulted in a death rate 3 times higher than in France, which had less complete records and more administrative friction in the process. The question of how much the populations of occupied countries knew about what was happening to the Jews who were deported is one that post-war historical memory has consistently answered in ways that minimize culpability. The standard narrative in most countries that were occupied is that the general population did not know about the death camps, that people believed deportees were being sent east for resettlement, and that knowledge of the systematic killing was restricted to those directly involved. The historical evidence does not fully support this narrative. Information about mass killings in the East circulated through multiple channels throughout the war, including soldier letters from the Eastern Front, reports by foreign correspondents in neutral countries, broadcasts by the BBC, and direct witness accounts from people who had managed to flee. What the population of occupied Europe knew was patchy and uncertain, but it was not nothing, and the degree of uncertainty varied significantly depending on how much effort a person made to seek information. The systematic use of forced labor from occupied territories in German war production constituted a massive economic enterprise. Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments and War Production managed an industrial economy that by 1944 relied on approximately 8 million foreign forced laborers, representing roughly 1/4 of the entire German workforce. These were people removed from their home countries by force, transported to Germany, assigned to work in factories, farms, and construction projects, and held under conditions that varied from poor to lethal, depending on their national category and the racial hierarchy that German policy applied. Soviet workers and Polish workers were subjected to the worst conditions, with minimal food, no freedom of movement, and exposure to violence from overseers. Workers from Western European countries were treated somewhat better, reflecting the same racial categorization that pervaded every aspect of German occupation policy. The entire enterprise was managed through an administrative bureaucracy. Workers were allocated to industrial plants through a system of requests and assignments. Businesses requested workers of particular types and in particular numbers. The allocation was managed by Speer's ministry. Payment was made through a financial clearing system. The labor itself was tracked for productivity purposes. It was a labor market, operating through institutional channels with the distinctive feature that the workers had not chosen to participate in it and could not leave it. Fritz Sauckel was the Nazi official responsible for the foreign labor program. He held the title of Plenipotentiary General for Labor Deployment, which describes precisely what his function was. He was tried at Nuremberg and executed in 1946. Albert Speer, who had been the ultimate institutional beneficiary of the forced labor that Sauckel procured, and who had known in detail how that labor was obtained and under what conditions, was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment rather than death. The distinction between the two verdicts reflected a complex of factors, including the way they presented themselves to the tribunal, the political calculations of the Allied powers about the post-war German state, and the legal theories that the tribunal applied about individual responsibility within institutional hierarchies. Speer presented himself as a technocrat who had been managing an industrial economy and who had not been ideologically committed to Nazism or personally involved in the atrocities of the regime. The presentation was substantially false, as subsequent historical research has demonstrated in considerable detail, but it was persuasive enough to produce a prison sentence rather than a death sentence. The Imperial Japanese Army's conduct in China between 1937 and 1945 encompassed atrocities on a scale that is still not fully integrated into the Western historical understanding of the war. The war in China is frequently treated as a separate conflict from the Pacific War, though it was part of the same imperial expansion and involved the same institutional actors. The Nanjing Massacre, which occurred over several weeks following the Japanese capture of the then Chinese capital in December 1937, killed somewhere between 80,000 and 300,000 people, depending on the methodology and sources used. The uncertainty in the numbers is itself historically significant. The killing was so extensive and occurred over such a period that precise accounting was impossible, and the Japanese military made no systematic effort to document what it had done in terms that would support later accountability. What is documented, both in the records of Japanese military units and in the accounts of foreign nationals who were in the city at the time, including diplomats and members of an international safety zone that had been established in the city, is the systematic nature of the killing. Male prisoners of war were executed in mass killings organized at the unit level. Civilian men of military age were identified, bound, marched to execution sites, and killed in groups. Individual soldiers killed civilians through a variety of means. The killing of women was accompanied by sexual violence on a scale that witnesses described as occurring openly in the streets and in homes throughout the city. The burning of the city's residential and commercial areas continued for weeks. The Japanese military command in the city was aware of what was happening. Some orders were issued attempting to restrict the behavior of the troops, but these orders were not systematically enforced and did not significantly affect the scale of the killing. The Japanese government and many Japanese educational and institutional actors have maintained a complex and contested relationship with this history. The Nanjing massacre appears in Japanese school textbooks with varying emphasis and interpretation depending on the political orientation of the curriculum in question, and it has been the subject of political controversy in Japan for decades, with nationalist voices arguing that the scale of the killing has been exaggerated for political purposes by China. This controversy is itself a significant historical phenomenon, illustrating how institutional memory management at the national level can maintain contested interpretations of well-documented events for generations after the events occurred. The use of chemical weapons by Japan in China is documented in both Chinese and Japanese military records and has been confirmed by forensic investigation of sites where munitions were used. Japan deployed mustard gas, phosgene, and other chemical agents in China on hundreds of occasions over the course of the war, in violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which Japan had signed. The use of these weapons was not the action of rogue units operating outside their institutional authority. Internal Japanese military communications show that the use of chemical weapons was authorized at the highest military and political levels, and was treated as a normal operational tool to be deployed when conditions warranted. The specific prohibition against chemical weapons under international law did not function as a restraint because the institutional structure within which Japanese forces operated had made a collective decision to disregard it. The American use of incendiary bombing against Japanese cities in the final year of the war is a subject that occupies a complex position in American historical memory. The firebombing raids conducted by the 21st Bomber Command under General Curtis LeMay, beginning in March 1945, were designed to burn Japanese cities, which were primarily constructed of wood, and were explicitly intended to destroy both industrial production capacity and the civilian workforce supporting that production. The raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night. It was the deadliest conventional bombing raid in history. The fires it created burned approximately 16 square miles of the city. Over 100,000 people were left without shelter. The bodies of those who died in the fires were, in many cases, impossible to recover or identify. LeMay subsequently oversaw the burning of 67 Japanese cities over the following months. The operations were planned and executed with the systematic professionalism of an organization that had developed considerable expertise in the logistics of large-scale incendiary attacks. Target selection, ordnance loading, flight routing, timing, and post-raid assessment were all handled through established procedures. After each major raid, damage assessments were compiled from aerial photography and analyzed to guide the selection and approach for subsequent raids. The whole enterprise was tracked on maps and in statistical summaries that measured the percentage of urban area destroyed as an operational metric. Robert McNamara, who served as a statistical analyst in LeMay's command during this period and who later became Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, reflected in a documentary interview late in his life that if the United States had lost the war, he and LeMay would likely have been prosecuted as war criminals for the firebombing campaign. This was not a statement he made defensively. He stated it as a factual observation about the relationship between victory and the legal treatment of wartime actions. The distinction between the strategic bombing of Axis cities, which was conducted on a scale and with an intensity that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and the acts for which Axis leaders were prosecuted at the post-war tribunals, was not a distinction of kind, but a distinction of outcome. The Allies won. The institutional framework within which the Allied bombing campaigns had been conducted survived and became part of the post-war international order rather than an object of prosecution. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945 killed somewhere between 129,000 and 226,000 people, with the wide range reflecting uncertainty about the complete death toll, including radiation effects in the months and years following. The decision to use the bombs was made through the normal channels of American military and political decision-making. The Target Committee, which met in April and May of 1945 to select the targets for the new weapon, was a formal interagency body that applied systematic criteria to the selection of target cities. The criteria included size, urban density, the absence of significant Allied prisoner-of-war installations near the target, and the ability to assess bomb damage after the attack. The committee explicitly preferred targets that had not been heavily bombed by conventional means, so that the damage from the atomic bomb could be clearly assessed. Hiroshima was on the target list, partly because it was a relatively undamaged city that would provide a clear demonstration of the weapon's effects. The destruction of the city was, among other things, an experiment whose results needed to be accurately measurable. Secretary of War Henry Stimson initially argued that Kyoto should be removed from the target list on the grounds that it was a city of great cultural and historical significance whose destruction would produce long-lasting resentment in Japan that would complicate the post-war relationship. His argument was accepted, and Kyoto was removed. The reasoning applied to Kyoto, that long-term geopolitical considerations should constrain the choice of targets, was not applied to any of the cities that remained on the list. The decision to spare Kyoto and bomb Hiroshima was a bureaucratic decision made by men weighing policy considerations in an office. The result was that Hiroshima was burned to the ground and approximately 80,000 people died in the first moments of August 6th, with additional deaths following over subsequent months. The survivors of the atomic bombings, the hibakusha, faced a distinctive set of institutional responses in the decades that followed. In Japan, they were subjects of social stigma, discrimination in employment and marriage, and restricted access to the medical documentation of their radiation-related conditions, which were extensively studied by American researchers through the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established by the United States in 1947, studied the health effects of radiation exposure on the survivors with considerable scientific thoroughness for several decades. Its institutional mandate explicitly excluded providing medical treatment to the survivors it studied. The Commission observed and documented radiation effects. It did not treat them. The distinction was deliberate. Treatment would have been an acknowledgement of responsibility. Observation and documentation was scientific research. The broader question of what the war's ending actually settled is one that rarely appears in the celebratory narratives that have accumulated around Allied victory. The Axis military powers were defeated. Their governments were dismantled and replaced. The leaders who could be found and prosecuted were tried, and in many cases, executed or imprisoned. The specific political entities that had prosecuted the war were dissolved. But the institutional structures, the bureaucratic habits, the administrative techniques, the legal frameworks for managing populations, the industrial infrastructure for producing weapons, the organizational methods for conducting surveillance, the procedures for managing internal dissent, these did not dissolve with the defeat of the specific governments that had operated them. They persisted, transferred, adapted, and in many cases were directly absorbed by the victorious powers. The intelligence agencies of the United States and the Soviet Union both recruited former members of Nazi intelligence and security services in the post-war period. The most extensively documented example is the Gehlen organization, established by Reinhard Gehlen, who had been the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front during the war. Gehlen negotiated with American intelligence in the final weeks of the war, offering his files on Soviet intelligence and his operational networks in Eastern Europe in exchange for his own protection and the protection of his personnel. The Americans accepted. The Gehlen organization operated under American funding and oversight from 1946 until 1956, when it was transferred to the control of the West German government and reconstituted as the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German Federal Intelligence Service, which it remains today. The organization that Reinhard Gehlen built to conduct intelligence operations for the Third Reich became, with minimal interruption, and through a simple transfer of institutional authority, the intelligence service of democratic West Germany. Gehlen's organization employed numerous former SS and SD officers, including individuals who had been involved in administering occupied territories in Eastern Europe and in the activities of the security services there. The American intelligence officials who managed the relationship with Gehlen knew this. It was documented in their own records. The decision to accept and fund the organization, despite this knowledge, was a policy decision made at senior levels of the American intelligence community. The reasoning was that the capabilities Gehlen brought were valuable for the emerging Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, and that the ideological and criminal histories of his personnel were secondary considerations. The systematic use of Japanese wartime research, both from Unit 731 and from other military research programs, by American defense agencies after the war has already been noted, but the broader pattern it exemplifies extends across multiple domains and multiple countries. The institutional knowledge generated by the Nazi state in fields including medicine, aerospace, chemistry, and organizational management of large populations did not disappear with the Nazi state. It was absorbed into the research and institutional infrastructure of the post-war world. Some of it was absorbed through formal programs like Operation Paperclip. Some of it was absorbed through the normal channels of academic publication and professional communication, as researchers who had worked within Nazi institutional frameworks published findings in post-war academic literature. Some of it was absorbed through the migration of trained personnel into post-war institutions, where they simply continued the kind of work they had been doing, now in a different institutional context. The concentration camp survivors, the displaced persons of post-war Europe, experienced the end of the war through a different institutional lens than the liberation narratives typically convey. The liberation of the camps by Allied forces in the spring of 1945 did not immediately resolve the situation of the survivors. Many were too ill to be moved, many had nowhere to go. The countries they had come from had been destroyed, occupied, or transformed into states that they could not safely return to. Jewish survivors in Eastern Europe who attempted to return to their pre-war homes sometimes encountered continued anti-Semitic violence from local populations who had moved into Jewish-owned properties during the war and were not welcoming to those who sought to reclaim them. The Kielce pogrom of July 1946, in which 42 Jewish survivors returning to a Polish town were killed by a Polish mob, occurred more than a year after the defeat of Nazi Germany. It was not an act of German anti-Semitism. It was carried out by Polish citizens in a country that had been liberated. The displaced persons camps that held survivors in the immediate post-war period were administered by Allied military forces and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The conditions in these camps were initially poor, and it took months of advocacy by Jewish organizations and by a formal inspection report by Earl Harrison, an American lawyer sent to investigate conditions, to produce significant improvements. Harrison's report to President Truman in August 1945, 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, described conditions for Jewish displaced persons as barely acceptable and noted that in some cases they were being held in facilities that had been used as concentration camps under the Nazi regime. The institutional response to the displaced persons crisis was slow, bureaucratic, and constrained by political considerations, including British policy regarding Jewish immigration to Palestine and American domestic immigration restrictions that remained in effect until 1948. The post-war trials themselves, both at Nuremberg and at the various subsequent proceedings, produced a body of case law and institutional precedents that have had lasting effects on international law, but they also produced significant gaps and exclusions that reflect the political realities of their moment. The medical experiments conducted in the concentration camps resulted in the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, which convicted 16 defendants and produced the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles for ethical medical research that established informed consent as a fundamental requirement. The Nuremberg Code was adopted in 1947. The United States Public Health Service's Tuskegee syphilis study, which had been ongoing since 1932 and which denied treatment to Black American men with syphilis without their knowledge or consent in order to study the natural progression of the disease, continued for 25 more years after the Nuremberg Code's adoption. It was not terminated until 1972, and only then because a journalist obtained documents about it through a federal employee and brought it to public attention. The institutional framework of the American public health establishment had continued to conduct exactly the kind of uninformed human experimentation that the Nuremberg Code had been written to prohibit. The nuclear arms race that began immediately after the war's end created its own institutional frameworks for managing and normalizing the existence of weapons capable of destroying cities. The testing programs that both the United States and the Soviet Union conducted to develop and refine their nuclear arsenals exposed large numbers of people to radiation without their informed consent, or sometimes without their knowledge. American nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands displaced the populations of inhabited atolls and exposed both the relocated populations and the indigenous people who had not been fully relocated to radiation from the tests. The people of the Marshall Islands were told by American officials that their sacrifice was for the good of humanity and for the sake of all mankind. The specific phrase used by a senior American official when telling the Bikini Atoll population that they would need to leave their islands for nuclear testing is documented in American records. The population moved. The tests were conducted. The contamination of the land and the people was extensive and long-lasting. The institutional framework that managed this, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Defense Department, the diplomatic channels through which the trusteeship of the Marshall Islands was administered, processed the whole matter as a series of administrative and policy decisions. The soldiers of multiple armies who were deliberately exposed to radiation during nuclear tests in order to study the effects of nuclear warfare on military personnel were not told what they were being exposed to and did not consent to the exposure. American, British, and Australian veterans of nuclear tests reported for decades afterward that their radiation-related health conditions were denied compensation by governments that declined to acknowledge the connection between the tests and their illnesses. These claims were adjudicated through administrative processes managed by Veterans Affairs and compensation bureaucracies that applied evidentiary standards that made it extremely difficult to establish the necessary causal connection. The institutional structure of post-war compensation systems was not designed to acknowledge what the institutional structure of wartime and post-war testing programs had done. The interrogation of German prisoners by Allied forces during and after the war produced intelligence that was systematically collected and analyzed. Less examined is the full range of methods used in some of these interrogations, particularly those conducted by Soviet forces, whose interrogation methods included torture, sleep deprivation, and other coercive techniques that would not have been legally permissible under the standards that were being articulated at Nuremberg at the same time. The simultaneous prosecution of German officials for crimes against prisoners and the use of coercive interrogation by some Allied forces on German prisoners reflects a legal and moral inconsistency that was managed by institutional silence rather than by principled resolution. The Morgenthau Plan, proposed by American Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau in 1944, called for the dismemberment of Germany after the war, the destruction of its industrial capacity, and its conversion into an agricultural nation. The plan was seriously considered at the highest levels of the American government and was initially endorsed by President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Churchill at the Quebec Conference in September 1944, before being abandoned in the face of opposition from military and diplomatic advisors. The plan's existence and the seriousness with which it was considered illustrates the degree to which the treatment of the defeated population of Germany was understood by Allied planners as a policy question to be resolved through institutional deliberation rather than as a moral constraint on what could be done. The options on the table included options that, had they been implemented, would have resulted in mass starvation of the German civilian population. They were considered and ultimately rejected on strategic rather than humanitarian grounds. The actual conditions in Germany in the immediate post-war period did include significant food scarcity, particularly in the Soviet occupation zone, where the removal of industrial equipment and agricultural resources for reparations compounded the effects of wartime destruction. The death rate among German civilians in the post-war period from starvation and cold was elevated, and the number of deaths attributable to post-war conditions has been estimated in various studies at several hundred thousand. The allocation of food and resources in occupied Germany was an administrative matter handled by the occupation authorities. Their decisions about allocation directly affected mortality rates among the civilian population. The expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe in the immediate post-war period was one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia between 1944 and 1950. The expulsions were authorized by the Potsdam Agreement of August 1945, which specified that the transfer of German populations from these countries to Germany should be effected in an orderly and humane manner. The actual expulsions in many cases were neither orderly nor humane. Estimates of the death toll during the expulsions range from 500,000 to 2 million, with the wide range reflecting the difficulty of counting deaths that occurred through multiple mechanisms, including direct violence, exposure, starvation, and disease during transit. The expulsions were carried out by the governments of the newly reconstituted states of Eastern Europe with varying degrees of organizational systematization. In Czechoslovakia, the expulsions were organized through administrative decrees. The Beneš decrees issued by President Edvard Beneš, which stripped ethnic Germans and Hungarians of their citizenship and property and authorized their forced removal. The decrees were issued in the immediate post-war period, signed by a head of state, and implemented through governmental administrative channels. They remain valid law in the Czech Republic and have been a point of diplomatic contention with Germany and Austria for decades. The Korean War, which began in 1950, less than 5 years after the end of World War II, used many of the same institutional frameworks, many of the same personnel, and many of the same operational approaches that had been developed during the Second World War. Many of the senior American commanders in Korea had been major figures in the Second World War. The institutional knowledge of how to conduct large-scale military operations was transferred directly. Some of the specific practices that had been condemned as war crimes when performed by the defeated powers were repeated in the new conflict by the victorious powers under different institutional labels and with different legal frameworks around them. The post-war period was not a period in which the institutional machinery of large-scale organized violence was dismantled. It was a period in which that machinery was reorganized, reallocated, and redirected. The classification of enormous volumes of wartime documents by all the major powers involved in the Second World War created archives that have taken decades to open and that in some cases remain partially or fully closed. The British government's records on certain aspects of its wartime intelligence operations, including the Ultra Intercepts and the activities of the Special Operations Executive, were not released until decades after the war. American records on specific covert operations, the full extent of arrangements with German and Japanese wartime figures, and the details of certain bombing operation planning remain subject to classification restrictions that have been progressively but not completely lifted. The Soviet archives from the wartime period are the least accessible of all, with significant portions remaining under classification in the Russian state archives that have not been subject to systematic declassification. What this means in practice is that the historical record of the war is incomplete in ways that are not random. The gaps in the record are not evenly distributed across topics. They are concentrated in areas where the institutional interests of the governments holding the records intersected with the content of the records in ways that made continued classification preferable to disclosure. The history of the Second World War, as it is publicly known, is a history shaped by these gaps, by the decisions of institutions over 8 decades to release some things and not others, to make some events legible and to leave others in darkness. The war produced institutional knowledge about the organization of mass violence that became part of the technical and administrative heritage of the mid-20th century. The logistical techniques developed to move millions of soldiers and their equipment across continents and oceans were adapted for civilian transportation and supply chain management. The statistical methods developed to manage industrial production for war were applied to post-war civilian economic planning. The administrative techniques for managing large populations that had been developed in the context of occupation and internment were applied in post-war colonial administration and in the management of displaced persons and refugees. The boundary between the institutional practices of wartime and those of the post-war world was not clean. The same tools, the same organizational principles, the same administrative frameworks moved across that boundary with their origins largely invisible to those who used them in new contexts. The post-war international order, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods economic institutions, the military alliances, the nuclear non-proliferation frameworks that developed over subsequent decades was constructed by the same states and in many cases the same individuals who had prosecuted the war. It incorporated lessons drawn from the war's catastrophes, but it also incorporated the interests, assumptions, and institutional habits of the states that had won. The permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council was assigned to the 5 powers that emerged from the war in dominant positions. The veto structure of the Security Council was designed to prevent those powers from having their interests overridden by the collective body. The post-war international order was not a neutral system designed to prevent future atrocities. It was a system designed by the victorious powers to organize the post-war world in ways consistent with their interests, with atrocity prevention as one element among many and not necessarily the most important one. The 61 countries that officially participated in the war, in various capacities ranging from major combatants to nominal declarations of war in the conflict's final weeks, included states whose participation reflected a complex of strategic calculations, colonial relationships, and coerced alignments that the standard Allied versus Axis framing does not fully capture. Brazil sent an expeditionary force to Italy. The Belgian Congo's uranium ore was used in the Manhattan Project. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa, Italy and Burma under British command. Australian forces fought across the Pacific and in the Middle East. The war was global in ways that the European and Pacific theater framing obscures, and the global character of the war meant that its effects, its disruptions of colonial relationships, its acceleration of nationalist movements, its redistribution of economic and military power were also global and long-lasting in ways that the post-war settlements addressed only partially. The liberation of colonial subjects was not part of the Allied war aims. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill in August 1941, affirmed the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live, language that was interpreted by colonized peoples around the world as a promise of self-determination. Churchill subsequently made clear that he had not intended the Atlantic Charter to apply to the British Empire. The colonial subjects who had fought for the British Empire, in the expectation that their service would be rewarded with political advancement, found in the immediate post-war years that the institutional framework of colonial rule was being reasserted rather than dismantled, in many cases with considerable violence. The return of French colonial authority to Indochina, the reimposition of Dutch authority in Indonesia, the British efforts to maintain control in Palestine, Malaya, and elsewhere were all conducted with military force and produced casualties that, while smaller in scale than the war itself, were significant. The institutional habit of organized violence did not end with the Japanese surrender ceremony on September 2nd, 1945. The formal ending of the war did not resolve the questions of how the systems that had made it possible came to exist, how they had been maintained and operated by ordinary people within institutional frameworks, or how they might be prevented from operating again. These questions were addressed at the post-war tribunals through the mechanism of individual criminal accountability, the identification and punishment of specific individuals judged to bear responsibility for specific crimes. The individual accountability framework left the institutional frameworks largely intact, because institutions are not persons and cannot be sentenced to death. The companies, the agencies, the military bureaucracies, the civil administrative structures that had enabled and participated in the crimes of the war continued to exist in various forms after the war, some under the same names, some reconstituted under new names, some dissolved and reconstituted as new entities with overlapping personnel and institutional cultures. The individuals who had operated within those frameworks moved through the post-war world in various ways, some prosecuted, most not, some continuing in their professional fields, most simply resuming lives that the institutional framework of post-war society organized around them. The survivors of the war, military and civilian, across all countries and on all sides, carried the experience of what they had seen and done and endured through the post-war decades, largely without the kind of institutional support or acknowledgement that post-war societies in later generations would consider appropriate. Post-traumatic stress, not then named as such, was treated where it was treated at all, through approaches that emphasized rapid return to function rather than extended therapeutic engagement. Veterans were expected to resume civilian life and to set aside what they had experienced in the service of the reconstruction that post-war society required. Many did, many did not. The institutional frameworks of post-war societies were organized around the needs of reconstruction and the Cold War competition, not around the psychological and moral integration of what the war had been. The administrative infrastructure of the war, with its efficiency and its procedural thoroughness and its systematic normalization of organized killing, was dismantled in part. The people who had operated within it were returned to civilian life, or transferred to new institutional frameworks, or in a minority of cases prosecuted. What they knew and what they had become capable of went with them. The documents generated by the war, the operational orders, the administrative records, the personnel files, the intelligence assessments, the financial records, the research reports, the after-action analyses, the census data from occupied territories, the transportation records from the deportation systems, the construction records from the camp facilities, the medical experiment documentation, the procurement records for war materiel, the population registration records, the correspondence between institutional actors at every level of the systems that prosecuted the war. These documents exist in archives in multiple countries. They are the most complete record of how the war actually functioned at the institutional level. They show, in detail, that no narrative account can fully convey how ordinary administrative processes were applied to extraordinary purposes, how paperwork and procedure became the mechanism through which decisions that killed millions of people were implemented, revised, and tracked. They are still being studied. They are still producing findings that complicate the versions of the war that were constructed in the immediate post-war decades. Some of them remain classified. The war has been over for more than 80 years, and the full administrative record of how it was conducted has not yet been made public. The last veteran of the First World War died in 2012. The last veterans of the Second World War are in their 90s and hundreds. The living memory of the war is ending. What will remain is the institutional record, the documents, the physical evidence, the scholarly literature built on decades of archival research, and the cultural frameworks that multiple generations have built around the war's meaning. The meaning that has been built around it is not the same as what the documents show. The documents show a war that functioned through procedure, through bureaucracy, through the application of institutional logic to purposes that the institutional forms were not designed to question. The meaning that has been built around it is a story of struggle between good and evil that resolved in favor of good. Those two things coexist in the historical record without resolving into each other. The war ended. The systems that had made it possible were partially dismantled, partially transferred, partially preserved, and partially forgotten. The documentation of what they had done was filed, classified, archived, selectively released, and partially destroyed. The people who had operated them went on with their lives. And in various forms, with various modifications, under various new names and within various new institutional frameworks, the administrative capacity for organized violence at scale continued to exist in the world that the war had left behind.